This is what the UFC Middleweight Rankings looked like in February 2013. This is when Anderson Silva was the most dominant champion in UFC history, having defeated the likes of Vitor Belfort, Yushin Okami, Chael Sonnen a couple of times, and defeating many others that are no longer in the rankings. A lot changes though once the rankings are developed, and you'll see that the middleweight division enters a state of chaos within the 5 years from 2013 till present day. So I'm excited for this one. Let's look at how the middleweight rankings have changed since February 2013. Let's get into it. Yushin Okami gets a decision win over Hector Lombard, bumping Lombard out of the rankings. Michael Bisping gets a decision win over Alan Belcher. At light heavyweight, Chael Sonnen loses against John Jones for the light heavyweight championship. And then later that month, a random shuffle put Sonnen down 1 and Rockhold into the top 5. Jacare Souza then gets a submission win over Chris Camozzi, bumping him into the top 5 of the division. At the same event, Rockhold got knocked out by Belfort, dropping him to 7th. Mark Munoz got a decision win over Tim Boesch, bumping him up to number 6. And then the big one, Chris Weidman knocks out Anderson Silva, claiming the UFC Middleweight Championship in a shocker. Chael Sonnen continued at light heavyweight, submitting Shogun Rua. Jacare Souza got another win in 2013, defeating Okami and bumping up to number 3. After the loss, Yushin Okami was released by the UFC. Francis Carmont filled the void that Okami left, defeating Costa Philippou and entering the rankings. Lyoto Machida then made his middleweight debut, knocking out Mark Munoz and entering the top 5. Tim Kennedy also made his rankings debut at middleweight, knocking out Rafael Natal. Vitor Belfort then knocked out Dan Henderson, who's not in the rankings. And then a random shuffle put Machida over Bisping. And to end off the year, Chris Weidman again defeats Anderson Silva, this time though, spaghetti leg. And at the end of 2013, this is what the UFC Middleweight Rankings look like. Obviously, the big note is that Anderson Silva was defeated by Chris Weidman, who is now the first middleweight champion in about 7 or 8 years that isn't named Anderson Silva. We also have a lot of people making their middleweight rankings debut in Machida, Carmont, and Tim Kennedy, and Jacare Souza moved up the rankings all the way to number 3. Let's get into 2014. To start off the year, Rockhold TKO'd Philippou, but nothing changed. And then Francis Carmont lost to Jacare Souza, bumping him down 1 spot. Lyoto Machida got a decision win over Gegard Mousasi, bumping him over Jacare Souza to number 3. Tim Kennedy got a decision win over Michael Bisping, bumping him up 2 spots, and Michael Bisping out of the top 5. Luke Rockhold submitted Tim Boesch, but nothing changed. And Costa Philippou got a knockout win over Lorenz Larkin. CB Dollaway then gets a decision win over Francis Carmont, replacing him in the top 10. Gegard Mousasi then submits Mark Munoz, replacing him in the top 10. Chris Weidman then gets a successful title defense over Lyoto Machida. A random shuffle puts Yoel Romero at number 10, making his rankings debut. Michael Bisping TKO'S Kung Lee, but nothing changes. Jacare Souza then gets a submission win over Gegard Mousasi, moving him all the way up to number 2. Yoel Romero then gets a controversial win over Tim Kennedy in what is now known as Stoolgate. Luke Rockhold then makes easy work of Michael Bisping, gets the submission win. Foreshadowing. Lyoto Machida bumps up 1 spot after getting a TKO win over CB Dollaway. And this is what the UFC Middleweight Rankings look like at the end of 2014. Not a whole lot changed in the top 5. I think the biggest story is probably Yoel Romero and Gegard Mousasi making their top 10 debut, with Romero being poised to make quite the run at middleweight. Now the middleweight division right now feels a little bit eerie. We have Weidman as champion, but we have Rockhold, Romero, Kennedy, Mousasi kind of creeping their way up the rankings. So let's see how everything changes in 2015. And this is the point of the video where I ask, if you can, take 2 seconds to go down and like the video and subscribe to MMA Nation. These rankings, they take a lot of time to do, so we really appreciate the likes, the comments, the subscriptions, everything. All right, now let's get into 2015, because it gets crazy. Gegard Mousasi TKO's Dan Henderson, bumping him up to the number 7 spot. And then Thales Leites submits Tim Boesch, making his middleweight rankings debut. And then the craziness, Anderson Silva gets a decision win over Nick Diaz. That's not the crazy part though. The crazy part is that Anderson Silva tests positive for a banned substance by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. He is not removed from the rankings yet, but he does drop down to number 5. Jacare Souza submits Chris Camozzi. But even more impressive, the same event, Rockhold submits Lyoto Machida, bumping him up to the number 1 contendership position. Michael Bisping gets a decision win over CB Dalloway, bumping him up 1 spot. And then MOUSASI gets a decision win over Philippou. Chris Weidman successfully defends his title for a 3rd time against Vitor Belfort, bumping Belfort down 1. Yoel Romero then knocks out Lyoto Machida, bumping him all the way up to the number 3 spot at middleweight. And Michael Bisping at number 9 defeats number 10 Leites. And then Anderson Silva is officially suspended and removed from the UFC Middleweight Rankings. In a shocking upset, Uriah Hall TKO'S Gegard Mousasi, which gives Hall his debut in the top 10, although he doesn't get over Mousasi in the rankings. Vitor Belfort again knocks out Dan Henderson. And then Robert Whittaker joins the rankings, getting a decision win over Uriah Hall. Yoel Romero continues his climb, getting a decision win, a very close decision win over Jacare Souza. Chris Weidman is then dethroned as Luke Rockhold TKO's him to win the UFC Middleweight Championship. And this is what the UFC Middleweight Rankings look like at the end of 2015. When I said it was going to be a crazy year, I wasn't lying. Luke Rockhold dethrones Chris Weidman. We have a new champion. We have an old champion in Anderson Silva test positive for a banned substance, completely removed from the rankings. We have Yoel Romero at number 2, this destroyer who has just ran through the middleweight division and is poised to have a title shot soon. The craziness continues in 2016. Yoel Romero is defeated by USADA. It eventually gets overturned, but for now, Yoel Romero is removed from the middleweight rankings. And just in time, Anderson Silva returns from suspension, getting put in at number 7. Gegard Mousasi gets a decision win over Thales Leites, dropping Leites from the rankings. Michael Bisping then gets a close decision victory over Anderson Silva, bumping Bisping up to the number 4 spot. Robert Whittaker then gets a decision win over Rafael Natal, bumping up to number 7. And then USADA catches another. Lyoto Machida gets caught for a banned substance. For now, isn't suspended, but does drop in the rankings. Jacare Souza then TKO's Vitor Belfort, but nothing changes. But what does change is Michael Bisping knocks out Luke Rockhold. Remember the foreshadowing. Michael Bisping is now your middleweight champion. Wow. That is followed by MOUSASI KOing Santos. That didn't matter. And then Daniel Cormier defeating Anderson Silva at light heavyweight, which also didn't matter or affect anything. And then Tim Kennedy is too inactive. He drops from the middleweight rankings. And then Machida is officially suspended by the UFC. He gets removed from the middleweight rankings in time for Yoel Romero to make his return to middleweight after it was proven that he didn't knowingly take a banned substance. Derek Brunson then gets his first top 10 win over Uriah Hall, bumping up to number 8. And then Gegard Mousasi TKO's Vitor Belfort, taking his position at number 5. Michael Bisping then gets a decision win over a not top 10 guy in Dan Henderson. Yoel Romero, back from suspension, gets a KO victory over Chris Weidman, becoming the number 1 contender at middleweight. Then Gegard Mousasi got his revenge against Uriah Hall, bumping Hall out of the top 10. Robert Whittaker TKO's Derek Brunson, bumping him ahead of Anderson Silva. And then Kelvin Gastelum KO's Tim Kennedy, which gives Gastelum the number 10 spot. And at the end of 2016, this is what the UFC middleweight rankings look like. Wow. What a crazy year 2016 was. Michael Bisping becomes middleweight champion by knocking out Luke Rockhold. Who would have predicted that? I don't think many people did. And then Yoel Romero, suspended, but comes back and climbs his way all the way up to number 1, gets a hell of a knockout over Chris Weidman. And yeah, this is what 2016 looks like. Now, a trend that the middleweight division has started is a trend of craziness, unpredictability. That doesn't change in 2017. That is why the middleweight division is one of the most exciting and why I've had a bunch of fun doing this, so let's get into 2017. And to start off 2017, Anderson Silva gets a decision win over Derek Brunson, bumping Brunson down 1. Jacare Souza gets a submission win over Tim Boetsch. And Kelvin Gastelum TKO's Vitor Belfort, bumping him up to number 8, but that victory doesn't hold. Kelvin Gastelum then gets caught for
the damn weed.
He is removed from the rankings and suspended by the UFC. Gegard Mousasi then TKO's Chris Weidman in a controversial kind of fight, knee on the ground. Then a big change in the rankings is Robert Whittaker TKO Jacare Souza, bumping all the way up to number 3. David Branch gets the win over Jotko, bumping him up to number 9 at middleweight. And Derek Brunson gets a knockout win over Dan Kelly. Whittaker continues his climb up the rankings, getting a decision win over Yoel Romero and winning the UFC middleweight interim title. Why is there an interim title? Good question. Why did the UFC not re-sign MOUSASI and let him leave to Bellator? Good question. But he's gone. And in a trend, a fighter leaves and a fighter comes back. Gastelum is back from suspension. In his return fight though, he loses by submission to Chris Weidman. Uriah Hall then TKO's Jotko, getting back to the top 10. Rockhold TKO'd Branch, but nothing changed. And then Derek Brunson KO'd a returning Lyoto Machida, bumping him up to number 6. And then George Rush St. Pierre defeats Michael Bisping to win the UFC Middleweight Championship. Yes, if you weren't following the UFC at this point, you'd be wondering, how the hell did that happen? And that's a question that I still ask myself today. And to follow that craziness, Michael Bisping takes a fight immediately after and loses to Kelvin Gastelum, bumping himself off of the top 5. George St. Pierre then vacates the middleweight championship. Wow, who would have thought that a fighter that, I'm not gonna keep going. Yes, he vacates. Robert Whittaker now by default is your UFC middleweight champion. And this is what the middleweight rankings look like at the end of 2017. Wow. Just wow. Robert Whittaker now champion after George St. Pierre. Who would have predicted that George St. Pierre at the end of the year would even be on the middleweight rankings, let alone number 4 after being champion? Michael Bisping all the way down to number 7 after being champion at the beginning of the year. Not only the beginning of the year, but in October, going from October to December, from champion to number 7. The UFC middleweight division is just in absolute chaos. What happens next in the division? I guess we'll see. And the first thing that they do is remove George St. Pierre because he has no intention to stay at middleweight. Jacare Souza then gets a KO win over Derek Brunson. USADA then defeats Anderson Silva again. Actually, it was the Nevada State Athletic Commission the first time. Anyways, Silva is removed. Yoel Romero then knocks out Luke Rockhold, bumping Rockhold down 1 spot. Brad Tavares then TKO's Jotko, giving Tavares his top 10 debut. David Branch KO's Santos, but that doesn't change anything. Machida then front kicks Belfort in the face, replacing him at the number 9 spot. Kelvin Gastelum then gets a decision win over Jacare Souza, bumping Souza down to number 5. Michael Bisping then announces his retirement and is removed from the UFC middleweight rankings. Robert Whittaker then kind of defends his title, not really, against Yoel Romero because Romero missed weight. Anyways, nothing changes. Lyoto Machida then follows Gegard Mousasi's path and leaves the middleweight rankings for Bellator. Paulo Costa, in his top 10 debut, TKO's Uriah Hall, bumping him up to number 9. But a night before Costa's win, Israel Adesanya gets the decision win over Brad Tavares, giving Stylebender his UFC rankings debut. And this is what the UFC middleweight rankings look like today. A lot of changes in the middleweight division over the past 10 years, although some familiar faces in Chris Weidman, Luke Rockhold, Jacare Souza still hanging around in the top 10, but guys like Robert Whittaker, Yoel Romero, Kelvin Gastelum that weren't in the top 10 in 2013 have now risen to the top of the division. And now just this year alone, we have some new guys, some new blood in the middleweight division in Costa, Stylebender, and Tavares that will hopefully bring a lot of excitement to the division. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Again, if you haven't, make sure to like the video. It helps us, helps support the channel, and I'm still pondering which division to do next. So comment down below, which division do you want to see next? I will do pound for pound rankings over the past 5 years. That I will do last though. So right now, I'm kind of deciding between bantamweight, men's bantamweight, or women's bantamweight. So let me know which division you want to see next. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I had a great time making this video. The middleweight division was just full of chaos. Make sure to watch the other complete history of UFC rankings videos. And again, make sure to subscribe. And I will see you in the rankings in another 2 weeks.